Welcome to MyLife Chassidus Applied, episode 536. This will be a special Purim edition, being that at the end of this week, Friday, is Purim. Okay. This program is in loving memory of Miriam Bas Eliyahu Altois, Aleh Shalom, and merit of Baruch ben Yoman ben Menucha Lana Altois, Kusil ben Lei Rochel and Rochel Bas Liba Farkash, dedicated by Pinchas Todres ben Miriam and Sarah Bas Rochel Altois. So, as I said, we're going straight to Purim this week. The whole month is called Chedesh Asher Nepach Lehem, the month that was transformed for them, for the Jewish people, from a possible complete genocide and disaster where Haman was attempting to kill Anoshim, Noshim, V'taf, all men, women, and children. The entire Jewish people were all under the Persian Empire, and it was transformed into La Yehudim Ha'isa Erev V'simcha V'sosan V'yikar. Not just was eliminated, it was transformed. That's the whole month. Yesterday on Shabbos, we read Parsha Zocher, the only Parsha that L'chol HaDeis in all opinions is Min HaTeirah, because before we come to the elimination of Haman, Mechias Amalek, the complete elimination, first we have to have Schira, remember to eliminate it. So we read Parsha Zocher. Before we get to Purim, being that today is Tes Adar. Tes Adar is a special date. So just because it's Tzmamish and Yonah D'Yema, let's begin with Tes Adar. Tes Adar, 85 years ago, in the year Tavshin, we're now in Tavshin Pehei, Frierdiker Rebbe arrived at the shores of the United States to permanently establish, until Mashiach comes, the headquarters of Chabad Lubavitch that was moved from Europe, but before that in Russia, Leningrad, before that in Lubavitch. As the Frierdiker Rebbe says, about Esther Golias Golsa Lubavitch. There's 10 Golias, 10 exiles. So on this day, he arrived in America. Frierdiker Rebbe was in America already 10 years earlier in Tofresh Tzadik for a visit for almost a year. But this became the place where he would remain, and for 10 years would serve as the Rebbe, the sixth Rebbe, and then the Stalkus Hilula of the Frierdiker Rebbe in Tofshin Yud 75 years ago, and the Rebbe assuming leadership. So it's 85 years from when the Frierdiker Rebbe came to America. The Rebbe makes a very big thing about it. It wasn't just that the Frierdiker Rebbe was saved with his family, and of course, as a Rebbe, he was able to re-establish and rebuild Chabad and Lubavitch in the United States, and from there spreading to the entire world. But it was a lot more than that. It was a new tkufa, the Rebbe calls it, a new stage, a new era in the spreading of Torah and of Yiddishkeit, and especially of Chassidus. Why? Because Chatzi Kadra Tachten, the way it's described, the lower hemisphere. So compared to the upper hemisphere, where Eretz Yisrael is, where Europe is, where Russia is, this is called the Chatzi Kadra Tachten, to the point that the Alter Rebbe says that Matan Torah did not happen in Chatzi Kadra Tachten in America. Famous Maimon in Tovkuf Samach Beis is brought in Hayem Yem. The Rebbe in a letter writes to the Frierdiker Rebbe and asks him, what does that mean Matan Torah didn't happen in Chatzi Kadra Tachten, in the lower hemisphere? Matan Torah happened in all of Earth, in all the cosmos, you can say. And the Frierdiker Rebbe in a letter printed in Tavshin Ches, in the Sefer Mamorim Tavshin Ches, explains that it means begoli. There are stages. Of course, Matan Torah affected everything. But Chatzi Kadra Elyon has a higher state, beruchnius. Like it even says in Chassidus about the difference between Sofen and Dorim, north and south. There's a difference. So Gashmi's dika difference, a physical difference, reflects on the spiritual difference. So Chatzi Kadra Elyon was a state where Matan Torah happened in that part of the world, that hemisphere, which is actually where the population, the main population of the human race was there, and of course the Yidden were there, and the Beis HaMikdash was there. So it's more begoli. Chatzi Kadra Tachten indicates a Tachten in the Tachtenim itself, a lower level. So begoli, the revealed way, didn't happen, and this explains the big chiddush. So Frierdiker Rebbe says clearly he wasn't interested in coming to the United States, to America. Says the Eibishter led me here to show that even a Chatzik Hadar Tachton, even in America, where they said America is anders, America is nicht anders, won't be different. That even here, more materialistic world, more modern world, a world where there's more apathy, the Evdim be'eretz Asher, as the Rebbe explains elsewhere, that you can get lost, completely lost in Eretz Asher, in the land of prosperity and affluence and comfort. Whereas Mitzrayim, Eretz Mitzrayim, may be more difficult and more oppressive physically, but it's Nidachim Eretz Mitzrayim. It's only Nidachim. You're only downtrodden, not Evdim. That even in a Tachten like this, you can bring Torah and build Mezdus Torah and Jewish communities and bring Yiddishkeit. And indeed, your Futza Meinesecha Chutza reached a new Slav, a new stage. I'll bring it even a Chatzik Hadar Tachten. And the more you can bring it down, the deeper is the Gili. So, like we say, Ikvus of the Mashiach in time is called the footsteps or the soul of Mashiach, the heel, we should say, Ekev, the heel of Mashiach, meaning the heel of history, that becomes the lowest part in time, the last generations, same thing in space. So the Tachten, as Chassidus explains, the Alter Rebbe explains, you lift up a building from the bottom, so then everything is lifted up. That's why he explains that Adam, the human being, was created from Ofa min Adam. All the other animals were not. They were created as they are. Here the Eibusha took Vayikach, he took Ofer, he took dust from the earth, because the Adam comes from the lowest part in order to elevate all of existence. Daimim Tzemeya Chayem Edaber. As he explains in Tere'er, which says, Lahavin Inyan Shinui Yitziras Adam, why the shape, the way the human being was created, was shaped, was crafted, is different than all other creatures. So the same thing here, Chatzik Hadar Tachten. So that's the significance. 85 years ago, began a new stage. And that itself, we've already also gone through stages. As the Rebbe has many times indicated, that Tachten Sheba Tachten is South Africa, Australia, and now we have Yidden everywhere. So we've covered Mamata Lamaila, all the levels. And of course, the Rebbe is saying we have to still do something. So it's all part of this picture of elevating the world from the bottom up, not from the top down. The Alter Rebbe explains, had Adam and Chava and Gan Eden, had they not eaten from Tes Adar, it would have been like an Avuka Gedela, like a great torch. That Mamayla Lamata, from top down, a great torch would draw and attract all the sparks from the world. But that didn't work out that way. So now we have to go find the sparks. And the more you go down, Echad Mehem Golus Barbaria, Echad Mehem Golus Sarmatia. Golus itself, it says, Stokos HaKadosh Baruch Hu L'Yisrael Gola Shepizram Beinei Umis. What's the tzedakah? That God did a great tzedakah for us. They separated the Jews among all the nations. That's Mipnei Golinu, Mipnei Chatenu, Golinu Martzenu. That's due to our sins. So Chassidus explains, spread among the nations to go find the sparks. So the whole meaning of Gola is Legolu Elo, Lehetzi Gedim, to find the Gedim, which are the divine sparks everywhere. So all this is is captured in 85 years ago. So what is the lesson for us today? That in our state, and America has become even more prosperous, and in many ways the Yidid is even deeper. And we have today after Gimel Tammuz, but we were told that it's up to us. Tut alz vasir can, do everything you can. Something that we have to do. Obviously, we're standing on the shoulders of giants before us, but there's something, one etzbektana, something that we must make an effort from the bottom up. So that's what Tes Adar indicates, the bottom up work. So Friedrich Rebbe came here, but then we send shluchim all over the world, including in Chatzik Hadar Tachten, to elevate. And that's our job, is to find somewhere, wherever you are, in your corner of the world, to elevate it. And that may be that last step that tips the scales and brings the Gula Amitis Vashlem. And with that, let us segue straight into the Purim, which will be this year. Friday is Purim, Shushan Purim is Shabbos, and that's Yisrael, Irma Kafes Chem Yerushalayim, I should say.
So Yudalid Ba'odar is going to be Friday, which is a unique Kvias. It's Friday, it goes right into Shabbos. We'll talk about that as well. So I got many questions have come in, both from this year and actually some from last year, which we didn't cover. But interestingly, Ashgacha Pratis, the battles being fought today, like B'yom HaMehem B'zman Hazeh. So we say Yom HaMe'elin Niskarim V'nasim, as we say in the Megillah, and as the Arizal interprets Niskarim V'nasim, that you remember, but they're recreated. So events that were happening still last year were still after October 7th, or what we call Shmini Atzeret Simchas Torah. So many things are still relevant. So let's begin with the most obvious question about Purim. What does Purim teach us about today's wars with our enemies? So the lessons are many. First of all, it tells us, and B'chol Dar V'Deir, like we say in the Haggadah, Eimdim Aleinu L'chal Eseinu, God forbid. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu Matzaleinu Miyadam. In every generation, it has different name, different time. The forces of Klippa, of Sitra Achre, the forces opposite of Kedusha come to attack Kedusha. And what's Kedusha? Am Yisrael. Started with Esau. Esau Yaakov. And Esau Sena Yaakov. Halacha Hibiyadu, as Rashi brings. So and this isn't just a personal hatred. It's a fundamental archetypal hatred that goes back even in their womb. Because Olam Hazeh is resisting in every way possible to bring godliness into this world. That's what it was made to do. The Nefesh HaBamis will fight the Nefesh HaLekis within each one of us. In a broader sense, that is ultimately all our enemies. Whether they consciously know what they're fighting and why they hate, is not negate. Bottom line is, there's some type of antipathy, some type of tremendous resistance. Haman manifested in the time of Purim. Amalek, Haman Agogi, coming from Amalek, manifested before him. And in every generation, you have the manifestation of this Isnagdus. In our time, you see Eretz Yisrael surrounded by enemies, many of which have declared war against Eretz Yisrael. Specifically today, Iran, Paras, Persia of the past, ancient Persia is today more or less Iran, that area, Iraq, and its proxies, whether it's Hezbollah, whether it's the Houthis, or Hamas. So battles are being fought. Thank God, many have been won. There's more to come. We should obviously send a bracha right now to all of the hostages should be released unscathed and return to their families. And the soldiers and those that are fighting on the front lines, wherever they may be, should be protected by Hashem. And just like in Purim, we should see La Yehudim Eisa Eri V'Simcha V'Sasan V'Yikar. And we should see the elimination, as the Megillah says, of all those enemies. Their obliteration, their annihilation. So that's the first most obvious, but there are also lessons to be learned. Someone asked, can we compare Hamas to Haman? Well, they're both three letters, Hamas, with a Hey Mem Samach, or if it's a Ches Mem Samach, and Haman is Hey Mem Nun. So quite similar, and the Nun and Samach are interchangeable. And we know Hamas, Molaretz Hamas, talks about crime and violence. It's a negative force, the negative forces. So definitely the comparison is obvious. But it goes deeper than that. What did the Jews do ultimately that won the war? So yes, at the end of it was they actually went to battle and they eliminated their enemies with Achashverosh's blessing and decree. But there were things they did before that. And let's enumerate some of them. As we go through the lessons we can learn from back then. So, a few things that jump out, obviously. Number one is, one of the first things we find, Mordechai lo yichre v'lo yishtachave. That Mordechai did not bow, not prostrate himself,
in any way to Haman. So even though Haman was a viceroy or second in command, and the king had given him many honors, everybody bowed to him, not Mordechai. And that incensed Haman. It's one of the things that instigated him. So you could argue, why not? What's the big thing? Show some deference. So in Halacha, in Sforim it says, because Haman firstly saw himself as an Avodah Zarah, like an idol, and he also had a little Avodah Zarah wearing one and bowing to Avodah Zarah. But it's a lot deeper than that. As we'll discuss a little later, someone asked the question that Pekuach Nefesh, if Esther was allowed to be with Achashverosh to save the Jewish people, and that itself is also a question, because there are three things that Pekuach Nefesh doesn't work: Gilead Arayis, Avodah Zarah, and Shvichas Damim. So, but if you could see that by Esther, why can't you say Mordechai should also bow in order to save the Jewish people? So firstly, besides the fact that we'll soon discuss, I'll discuss a little later, that Esther was not over because for many different reasons, and Sforim talk about it, and it was not something she willingly did. And even the Noda B'Yehuda has a whole shuvah where he talks about this, that it was for the protecting of the people. So there are an exception in certain instances, especially when it was not willing, even though later she did come to the Melech willingly. We'll talk about that. But with Mordechai, it's a lot deeper than that in a way. What do I mean deeper? Bigger problem, I should say. Because would that have helped had he not bowed? Do you think had he not bowed, then Haman would have been happy? It's true, it's incensed him. And it definitely was like maybe the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak. But Haman hated the Jews, period. And he was looking for a way to destroy them. This added to it. But the key point is another thing, which brings us to another question. Why Yidden are called in Megillah Yehudim? Mordechai Yehudi. From the Shevet Yehuda, but from the name Yehuda. Yehudi. From Shevet Binyamin, actually. But connected to Yehuda, like Yehudim. Why Yehudim? So the Gemara says, because Yehudim is from the word Meida. Meida b'Hashem. Kol ha'kefer b'Avodah Zarah. Everyone who denies idolatry and accepts Hashem, that's a Yehudi. Why is that so important? Because that's the strength of the Jewish people. You could think with your logic, let's placate, we'll bow a little, we'll compromise, we'll negotiate. That's the big mistake. The enemy is an enemy. They're not negotiating with you. Any negotiation is just another, okay, so you gave me a hand, now I'll come for a foot, as they say. Mordechai knew this very well. He knew what Haman hated most was the very essence of the Jewish people. He wanted to kill them, Pasha Begashmis. So he understood the strength of the Jews is to hold on to God, not to placate and not to appease. So it was very the essence of the victory ultimately of the Yidden, because they held on, they knew that the bracha comes from Hashem, not from some logical negotiation or, I'll compromise myself and I'll make the guy happy, in this case the enemy happy. Which answers the question that someone asked. The question was, why is it so important that Mordechai not bow to Haman? After all, Jacob bowed to Esau 7 times now. So firstly, Esau was his brother. Esau represented Take, the other side, Lu'umalum Yamotz, but it doesn't say anywhere he represented Avodah Zarah. And Yaakov was finding a way to get to reach his brother. So he brought him through tefillah and through a bribe. He appeased him. Here it was a whole different story. Haman represented Mamash Avodah Zarah, Mamash Klippa. And Mordechai knew that. Any compromise, any inch, even a drop, would be our downfall. There we find Esau did reconcile ultimately with Yaakov. B'chol libay or not b'chol libay, with entire heart and not, and L'asad Lavi, there'll be a reconciliation. Remember Esau, Yaakov, Esau, Amurim, B'Pasha are both brothers and twins of the children of Yitzchak and Rivka. He wasn't isbared yet, either completely or partially.
With Haman is Amalek. Shvirasan Zui Takanasa. It's Pampash Aveda Zara. The only way to deal with Haman is complete destruction. He's your sworn enemy. A Nazi, to use modern lingo. There's no conversations and no negotiations with a Nazi. It's Amalek. It has to be complete and destruction. Now, if he does complete Shuvah and he is complete surrender, is another story. But that you don't see that at all. So the number one lesson we learn from that is being strong with Ge'en Yankiv, with our Jewish pride. The application today is very clear. There's no compromises. Yes, if the enemy unconditionally surrenders, gives up the hostages, takes out from their constitution any call for destruction, stops educating their children to hate Jews and kill Jews, that would be a whole other story. But that's not what's happening. So the lesson is clearly not to bow at all. Don't give them any credence and any credibility. I'm not getting now into specifics whether to negotiate for the hostages. It's a big debate. Some argue that it's a mistake because you're giving them an incentive to take more hostages. But regardless of the pact, we also see the United States and its president is telling Israel, you have a green light to do whatever it takes. Mamish, the story of Purim. Achashverosh saying, after reversing the decree and the second decree that he passed, go ahead and destroy all your enemies. And don't be bashful. And don't bow. Psychologically, emotionally, in any way. That's the first lesson. The second thing we find, what Esther did. She told Mordechai, Hikalu kol ha-Yehudim, gather all the Jews together and let them daven and pray, especially children who Mordechai gathered to say the psukim. So you see the second thing. Fasting. We'll talk about that also some more shortly. In other words, ruchnisdike things that you know is the strength of the Jewish people. Now, obviously, you have to do everything b'derech hateva. Mordechai overheard the plot against the king, and later the Divrei Hayomim, when it was read, the king wanted to reward him. Esther, of course, was with the queen of Achashverosh, and she used her influence. So, of course, you have to fight the wars you have to fight, and then later actually destroy the 75,000 Haman and his 10 sons, and all the 75,000 enemies. But that's in addition to the ruchnius, to the achdus, and that's why Purim, as he explains in Monas Halevi and other places, is all about achdus. Shleach Monas Ishlereheyu, Matanas Lavyenim, make a suda together, the unity. And Haman, the enemy, recognized that subconsciously. He said, Yeshnei Am Echad, when he came to Achashverosh, Mefuzim Mefedet Ben Amim. Here's this one nation, one single nation, Am Echad he called them, that spread among your entire empire. V'doseim shenis mekolam. And their faith and their religion is different than all. And that's what irked him. He wanted them to conform. He wanted them to bow. Physically and spiritually and psychologically and emotionally. The Am Echad. That's what that kept them together. So Purim we celebrate through Achdus. Through Tefillah. And yes, we fast, Tainus Esther, the day before Purim, as Esther requested then. So we have all these lessons for today as well, that we have to fight the wars and we have to do it b'teik of Ge'en Yankiv, and we have to do the ruchniyazdika thing, the spiritual part of the war. So Purim, and then of course the Achdus and Avos Yisrael that is so necessary, especially in a time when there's challenge. Because that's what the enemy wants. They want to separate us. So we have to join as one, and then we're indestructible. And of course, there are many more lessons, but it's as direct as it gets. Besides that is the region, as I said, Paras, Persia of old, Iran of today, and its proxies, all around that it's Yisrael. Okay. So with that, let's go to a few other questions. I'll go in the order that I have them organized here, but they're all connected to these thoughts. Someone writes, is there a way to replicate today the hurrah, hurrah, hurrah that eliminated Stalin? You know that in Tafshin Yud Gimel, Purim, Farbrengen, I had the Rebbe saying several Maimorim. At the end of the Farbrengen, the Rebbe told a story about how a new Tsar came into power, and people were screaming, hurrah, 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 and a chassid also yelled. And that caused a decree, or the Tsar to die. So the Rebbe told it. No one knew at the time, but a little while later it was discovered that's when Stalin died. Poison, no one knows exactly the details. And he was about to announce a tremendous Gzeira decree against Yidden. So someone's asking, is there a way to replicate that? Well, a Rebbe has his particular, obviously, power. What we have to do is copy that, either through the Simcha, which I should have mentioned as well, Purim Simcha, the Achdus, and through that we hopefully can invoke the Rebbe's Keiches to eliminate all enemies of ours. Another detail someone asks about that is like this. Let me just find it. All these questions, it's hard to find everything. Anyway, I'll speak from memory. Someone asked the question, if the Rebbe had the power to defeat Stalin by saying "Rah, rah," why hasn't the Rebbe done more to defeat Hamas in Iran and their acolytes so they cannot do harm to us? So that question, we don't ask questions on the Rebbe and on the Eibishter. We obviously do whatever we can to invoke their rachamim, meaning the Rebbe, and the Rebbe interceding on our behalf with the Eibishter. And everything is done, we don't make the cheshbeinos for them. What we have to do is do whatever we can, what we learn from them. And it basically means Simcha Peiris Geder, especially on Purim. We have the Keiches of Purim to eliminate Haman and the Haman of every generation and the Amalek of every generation. And we talked about the ways we're told how to do it. Through Ge'in Yankiv, Le'yichra v'le'yishtachave, and everyone can interpret that in many ways. Le'yichra v'le'yishtachave doesn't always mean physically bowing. It could be generally that you defer, you give materialism too much value. Serve God, don't serve anyone else, and don't serve human institutions. And the other things that we spoke about. So that is regarding that question. So in that context, somebody wrote, it's taught in the Megillah that on the 23rd of Sivan, Achashverosh signed a new decree allowing us to defend ourselves against Haman and his supporters. Because we know, it was one thing that the king basically said to kill Haman and his men, his children, and all his entourage, so to speak, all his cohorts. But then there came a second decree. And someone asked the question, why did we need a second decree from Achashverosh allowing us to defend ourselves? Without a second decree, would the Jews have said, oh, maybe we shouldn't defend ourselves because it's against the law? Yeah, you needed the second decree because the first decree was never abolished. So even though Haman was no longer there, but others, there was a law in the books that said on this and this day, you'd give a law, etc., etc. What would God forbid, the Hashmid, the Lahareg, all the Jews in the kingdom. So that's why I needed a second decree. Now, when was that? Chav Gimel Sivan. Although the battle and the victory didn't take place until months later on Purim, it's taught the 23rd of Sivan was the beginning stage of the victory as Achashverosh's new decree paralleled the revelation of spiritual energy that gave us the strength to defend ourselves and win the war. In today's war in Israel, this person writes, we can clearly see the negative effects of not being allowed to defend ourselves as the USA and other countries put enormous pressure on Israel. Well, we're talking here before Mr. Trump came into power. On Israel not to fight in Gaza and completely defeat the Hamas terrorists. Can we ask Rabbi Jacobson a question? If we are taught that all our holidays are not just history lessons, but have the same spiritual energy as when the holiday first occurred, can we say that hopefully this year, on Purim, with the power already coming from the Duchav Gimel 23rd of Sivan, will be a revelation of spiritual energy, and that the USA and other countries will now allow Israel to defend itself and be victorious, and with Hashem's help and blessings, that peace will be restored, and all the enemies will be eliminated, I should add. Absolutely. That's exactly what we're discussing. But you put it in good words, so therefore I read it. This was written actually before Mr. Trump became president, this question. So it's very appropriate. And in that spirit, someone writes, should we start now constructing a gallows so the moment the IDF apprehend all the terrorists of Hamas and its co-conspirators, the infrastructure will already be in place to hang them? Well, I don't know if it has to be through an actual gallows, but the idea, obviously, the same gallows that Haman prepared for Mordechai, Rahman al-Islam, ended up killing him. So by all means, again, they unconditionally surrender and return the hostages and change the whole tune is another story, which obviously is not happening. Okay. How do we justify, someone writes, the killing of 75,000 enemies? Like the Megillah says, and here it's actually said, Esther 9:5-16, Tes Hay to Tes Zayin, Pasuk Tes Zayin, the end of the Megillah. The Jews kill over 70. That's when once Achashverosh made that decree, they went and killed 75,000 of their enemies after gaining the upper hand. Yet they famously, as the Pasuk emphasizes, did not lay a hand on the plunder. They did not take any spoils of war. This restraint is often praised as moral discipline. But the scale of the killing, far exceeding Haman's household, raises questions. Given that the original decree was defensive, to destroy, kill, and annihilate attackers, Esther 8:11, how do we justify the preemptive slaughter of so many, and does the refusal to take spoils adequately address the ethical tension between survival and vengeance in a post-exile context? In post-exilic context. Well, first of all, you can ask the question the other way around. Maybe there were a lot more than 75,000. And I'm not in any way dismissing every death is a tragedy. But these 75,000 were actual threat. It's not correct. It wasn't just preemptive. It was preemptive as far as killing them before they kill us. Hashkem v'hadim. Obviously you do that. You don't wait. But you're talking about an active threat. Remember, once the decree was passed, Haman had already collected a whole bunch of cohorts that were ready to do this. Again, let's talk about the Nazis. Were there only 75,000 people that were a threat to the Jews in Germany and in Europe? Of course not. They already had the collaborators and they already had rounded up people. So you could even argue, how do you know it was only 75,000? But clearly they knew. So that's number one. And when it comes to a threat, what's the question even? When Haman was gone, it wasn't like the threat was gone. The threat didn't leave. That's why they needed Achashverosh to write the second decree, the second decree to allow them to protect themselves. So that's number one. And completely morally justifiable, not just justifiable. We're talking about total genocide. Not partial. Even that's enough, but total. So that's obvious. So why do we praise them for not taking spoils when they killed so many people? So I just explained, the killing was nothing to do with it. On the contrary, by not taking from the plunder, from the spoils, that just demonstrated where they were coming from. Because if they were just coming because they were bloodthirsty, God forbid, then what do? Of course, every battle, every army, that's what they do. They take spoils. Because the intention was not to kill. The intention was to protect themselves and to build. They weren't interested in taking the plunder. That was not the goal. It was purely a threat to them. Even if they taken plunder, you could argue that they were justified. But let's say that's not the case. But that's back at the point. That only shows you what their intention was. Okay. Is there a connection Might as well go over to this. Again, it's not in particular order here. Is there a connection between the redemption of Purim and the final redemption? Well, based on what we're saying now, absolutely. So first of all, remember all Geulas Shem Echad. Rashi says that, Megillah. The Geula is B'Shem Geula. And when it comes to Purim, even though it was still Akata Avda Achashverosh Anan, even after the Geula of Purim, we were still under Achashverosh, and the Geula Amitis Vashlema had not come yet, but we speak the language. Bismach Geula Legula, why Adar Sheni in a leap year is in the second month, because it's close to the Geula of what? Of Geulas Nisan, of Pesach. Pesach Kimet Seis Chemeretz Misamer and Niflois. So all the Geulas have something in common. Obviously, the Geula Amitis Vashlema is the ultimate and the full picture. The second point is that Geula comes through Masenu V'Avedasenu. So just like Geula's Purim came because of our actions and our work down below, obviously with God's help, so too the Aveda today, like we spoke about the different lessons we learned from Purim. And obviously the most important point is that as the Rebbe promised us and told us, and all the Simonim, that we're living in Ikvus of the Mashiach, that this is the final battle. Why we still have to go through this, we don't have an answer to that. But we've been told time and again that we're at the threshold. And may it be the last remnants, and we can march straight to the Geula Amitis Vashlema with the koyach that we have from Purim. Before we go into more details, here may be a good segue. A bunch of questions came in. We know, it says in Medrash, and even Halacha, that Rambam brings it, the end of Hilchos Megillah, that all the Yom Tevim will be bottled when Mashiach comes. All the Sifrei Tanakh, except Chamisha Chumshei Torah and the Megillah. And Purim, Lo Yavre Le'elam. So the question is why? A few people wrote about this, and I think it's a good place to address it. So let me read the question. There are teachings that say the Megillah is the most important book in the Torah. If so, should we be studying and reading the Megillah every day and not just on Purim? Albeit only saying the bracha first when required to on Purim and reading it without the bracha the other days. So that's an additional question. I'll answer that at the end. If after Mashiach comes, the only holiday we still celebrate is Purim, how can we get to a level during Mashiach's time of not knowing the difference between cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordechai? Because during Mashiach's time, there won't be evil, so therefore cursed is Haman will be irrelevant. And let's start with the initial question. Did the Rebbe ever explain why Taka Purim will not be bottled as the other holidays will be? And the Megillah will be different than the other Sifrei Tanakh, or Nach, I should say. What the Rambam meant, as he says, that after Mashiach comes, only the Megillah will remain. So yes, indeed, there's a Maimer, there's more than one, but I'll just refer to Maimer, a very powerful Maimer. You can listen to it. We have it today on tape. Purim Tavshin Tezayin, where he begins. Lahavin Maimer Chazal, this Maimer Chazal, that La'asad Lavi Kol Asidin Kol Hayom Tev will be bottled except Purim. It's based on Torah from the Alter Rebbe, and based on a Maimer in Tafresh Chavov with that same Dibra Masach. Briefly, the Rebbe explains that when we say all the other Yom Tov will be bottled, Chaz v'Shalom, the Torah is nitzchi, the Torah is eternal. We're saying Kishraga, B'tira Amayahana, like a light, like a candle in the light of the sun. The Gili will be so great that everything will be bottled, meaning bottle and mavutla as you won't even sense it, because what does a candle look like in the light of the sun? Chassidus even says it's dark, because the light of the sun is so bright. So why is Purim different? Because Purim came from Golus. All the other Yom Tevim are all connected to a tremendous Gili. Even Yetzias Mitzrayim came out of after Golus. But Purim came in a time of Golus, and they remained in Golus. So whatever comes from the darkest, from the dark itself, remains forever and ever.
All the other Yom Tovim are Giluyim, great Giluyim. That's why you don't find the name of Hashem in the Megillah, because it's higher than names. A name is already a Gilui. Here's coming from a level, Le Yisramas, Le B'Shem Le B'Shem Kates. You don't see the name of Hashem ever in the Megillah. It's the Etzem. And the Etzem will always be there. The Asad Lavi, no matter how big the Gilui, the Etzem of Purim will always be there. The Rebbe goes on to explain, so why is there an opinion that Yom Kippur will also be there? Because Yom Kippur also has an element, L'mayla Mishtalshas. But remember, Purim, Yom Kippur is through fasting, and Purim is through a meal, through Gashmis. It's a weekday, technically. And that's the same idea. And once something saturates the very mundane and the cheshach of the world, that's something that that will not be nullified, like the candle in the light of the sun. That's the Nukudas Advarim. As I said, it's explained in a number of places, but I just gave some of the sources. Okay. So with that, let's go over to a few other questions regarding Purim. Some of them we touched upon, some are more details. So let's go back to the question. We talked earlier about the way the decree was annulled. One of the points was fasting. That's why we have Tes Esther. Why does fasting annul decrees? Esther asked everyone to fast along with her in order to help convince Achashverosh to annul the genocide decree. But logically, it would have made more sense not to fast and to eat extra so we could be stronger if we had to fight to defend ourselves. So how does fasting work to annul decrees? Even if we eat 3 meals a day and each meal takes a half hour, that means for 22 and a half hours, a majority of the day, we're already fasting. So how is it possible for any bad decrees to ever happen? And if fasting can truly annul a bad decree, why don't we try having a public fast to annul the decree of a 2,000-year-long Golus? So the answer is the concept of miyut chel b'vidami, which means when a person fasts deliberately, they actually weaken themselves, but what are they doing? They're diminishing the chelev and dam, the fat and the blood, basically the passion and the pleasure. That's why we say by a korban, you're makriv the chelev, the fat and the blood. The fat is the pleasure, and the passion is the blood. The miyut chel b'vidami. That's what a fast does. This does not mean the fast between meals. We're talking about fasting in addition, where it hurts. When a person fasts, they feel it. You fast in Yom Kippur, you fast on Tisha B'Av. I'm not getting into the reasons for the fast, but right now that's what a fast does. However, that's why, before the however, and that's why fasts were used as a method of annulling decrees, because you're showing that you bring like a carbon from your own flesh, from your own fat and your own passion, from your own fat and blood. It's like a carbon. And that is reich necheich la'Hashem. And that opens up, and pierces have, as Esther knew, that's the in of a tainus. That's why you have fasts throughout. You have Masechta Tainus, talks about the different fasts. Here's the big qualification. Besides the fast that we're decreed to do, basically obligated throughout the year, the 4 fasts, and then we have also Yom Kippur, and we have the details of all the fasts throughout the year. We don't increase in fast today. There was a time that that was a way of Aveda, because the Baal Shem Tov said that's not the derech any longer. The Alter Rebbe explains in the Geras HaTshuvah. And one of the aspects of it is because we see people today don't have the ability to do so. That means it's not needed. So do it with preik, with tzedakah. Tzedakah is giving also of your efforts. So in a way, it replaces a tainus. Now there have been designated tainus shas, as we know. The Rebbe was participated and initiated at times for different reasons. But that's a halacha decision based on authorities. But generally, we don't try to make more fast than necessary, or at all, except in these few exceptions. Obviously, Tainus Esther asked, and that became part of more than Minig Yisrael, something that we do in all the generations. But that's the significance of a fast. And that's how it works. Now, whether today Rabbanim would come and say, let's do a fast, Laman, the hostages and so on, if there's a consensus, a legitimate Rabbanim, they have a right to do so. But generally, they stay away for the reasons I just said, except when there's a real authoritative reason or a Sarah, God forbid. So this brings me to another question that someone asked. Why then don't we fast or wear sackcloth today in honor of the hostages? To show solidarity with them? So the answer is exactly like I said. That's not the derech b'chlal. If Rabbonim, legitimate Rabbonim, would come and say, but they don't. And you don't find that that's something that's done. Tainus Shas, yes, we find. Again, not common, but there is that concept. So it's not for us to come to make these decisions. You want to add, on their behalf, give more tzedakah. We're talking Purim is coming, Matanas Lavyenim, Shleach Monas, give food. Give of yourself. But not fasting is, as I said, something we avoid doing, except for the rare instances where we're given a hayrah from authoritative place. Okay. Being that this year Purim is Friday, so the Kohen asks, what is the significance of Purim falling out on a Friday? Did the Rebbe ever speak about it? And the answer is yes. So firstly, just begin with a story. I remember Purim was Friday, Tavshin Mem Aleph. I was sitting as a bocher. That was my time when I was the main writer of the Fabrengens, those years from Tavshin, end of Tes Mem, through Nun Beis when the Rebbe had the stroke. I was the main writer of the Rebbe's Fabrengens. So I was sitting upstairs in my office over 770. Purim. I forgot what I was working on. I was maybe working on the Fabrengen from last Shabbos. I think I had finished it already. But I was upstairs. This was around 3:30, Friday afternoon. A little while later, someone comes running up. The Rebbe just said a maimer, b'layla hu nodar shnas hamelech. If I recall correctly. After Mincha, which was upstairs in 770, the Rebbe said to close the doors, which was the Rebbe's custom. No one would walk in. And the Rebbe said the maimer. There was no recording, but there were a few people who said there, Rabbi Mentlik, I think Rabbi Levin, and they wrote B'Shas Ma'aseh the Maimer. So we have the Maimer. That was Purim Friday. Who would know Purim afternoon that I was going to say a Maimer? But he did. That Shabbos was a Fabrengen as well. Shushan Purim. So that's just the Chivusa de Milsa story. The Rebbe's Nekuda about Friday is Bechlal. Friday is the Erev Shabbos, which means it's already entering into Teimeh Chaim Zocher, we're tasting of Shabbos. So when Purim comes on Shabbos, when Purim comes on Erev Shabbos, it has a particular strength, the strength of going straight into the Karosel Shabbos Einig. You have the Megillah of Purim and the Megillah of Erev Shabbos going into Shabbos, because Purim Mamish goes right into Shabbos. In Eretz Yisrael, of course, Yerushalayim will be Shushan, Purim will be Shabbos. So what's the Megillah of Shabbos? So the Megillah of Shabbos, like I said, is Einig, pleasure. Purim is Simcha. Yehuda Meisha Erev is Simcha. Adaloi Simcha Adaloi Yada. Simcha, Chassidus says, is connected to Bina. Shabbos is connected to Einig, to Chochmah. Now, of course, Shabbos also has Simcha. B'yem Simchaschem El HaShabboses. And Yontif and Purim has an element of Einig too. But primarily, so you have a combination of both of them together, with Einig being more Atzmi, Simcha being more Bigoli. That's where you find Shabbos, even though we do invite guests, but the real mitzvah of Achnosas Orchim, because you can't do Simcha alone. Einig you could have alone. You could sit and be learning and having a great pleasure without anyone else there. Simcha is in Simcha Kresi, the Rambam Paskins, you need to have others. Which is why Purim is Matanas Lavyenim, Shleach Monas, Asuda, with other people. So you have here both the Megillah of the Atzmi of Einig
and the Ispashtus of Simcha, Peres, Geder, of Purim, that come together. That's one explanation that Rebbe gives, among others. And in general, anything that goes into Shabbos, B'chlal, immediately, Vayichul HaShamayim, V'Oretz V'chol Tzvom, Shabbos elevates. So you have Purim and you have the Aliyah of Purim that comes not with a hefsek, because every Shabbos after Purim is an Aliyah of Purim. But here it comes straight from Purim right into the Aliyah of Shabbos. So it just intensifies everything that Purim stands for. Additionally, Purim is connected to Matan Torah. The Gemara says in Shabbos, the pasuk v'kimu v'kibla haYehudim. V'kimu v'kibla haYehudim. What's the two words? So it says because by Matan Torah, meidor rabba la'raisa, because the Eibishter, so to speak, compelled them to receive the Torah by placing the har kegigis above them, so they could argue we didn't really fully accept it at our own volition. Comes Purim, it says v'kimu v'kibla haYehudim kimu masha kiblu kfar. They were Mekayim, now they consummated what they received by Matan Torah. And there he goes on to speak how Matan Torah is connected to Shabbos, L'kula Alma b'Shabbos nitna Torah. Shabbos is Torah, and so Purim is the shleimus of Matan Torah of Shabbos. So you have here both milas of the Shabbos of Matan Torah of Shabbos, and also the milah of Purim, which is Kimu v'Kibla Yehud. Okay. There's so many more questions. I will try to cover as many as I can. How can we explain the obligation of drinking on Purim until we can't distinguish between blessed as Mordechai and cursed as Haman? Mitzvah chayiv inish l'psuma, that Purim it's a mitzvah to get drunk, intoxicated, to the point ad the lo yoda, that he can't distinguish between Order Haman and Baruch Mordechai. So first of all, what is this thing of getting intoxicated altogether? And to the point you can't distinguish between what? The cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordechai. Is that a mile? You want to know that Haman is Haman and Mordechai is Mordechai, and this one's cursed and this one's blessed. So Chassidus explains that we're not talking about intoxication in the true sense of the word, in the literal sense. Even though, yes, Yidden have gotten drunk, but as we know, the Rebbe was very careful of that, because you don't want it to be frivolous, and you don't want it to be something that is not a Kedusha. So when a real person, meaning a person of Aveda, a Rebbe, a Chassid, who really knows how to drink, but it does not become a Shugah, and brings them L'mayla Medas, Adle, not Lamata Medas. So what are they coming to? A place that you can transform Order Haman into Baruch Mordechai. Not that you don't know the difference between a blessing and a curse, between good and evil. God forbid, and someone will say, he's so drunk, he doesn't know the difference. He did something bad. No. You have the power to reach a place where you can transform. Generally speaking, Asay Tev and Sermon are two different paths. You avoid Haman. Purim gives you the power to transform Haman. The Gemara says. Transformation, like I said, how about the L'psuma part? So L'psuma part is an issue. Rabbanim have given out letters, you can't just drink, especially when you drink in a way that's, as I said, socially or frivolously. That's not the way of the Torah. If there was drinking in a way of Gedusha, that a person cut to that level, yes. But you have to ask yourself, are you on that level? So then how do we reach this level? So that brings us to the other famous story, which is also equally controversial. And that is the story of Rabba and Rab Zera. Let's just read it inside the question. So the story goes that came Purim, and Rabba came to Rab Zera, and they bring together Purim. They got, it says, L'psuma, chayvin ish l'psuma. And then, kom l'Rabba v'shachte l'Rab Zera. Rabba rose and shecht, literally means he slaughtered to Rab Zera. And then he performed a miracle and brought him back to life. The next year came Purim. He invited Rab Zera again to the party. Rabbi Zera said, not every day there'll be a miracle.
And he refused. How do you explain this Gemara? So there's many commentaries explaining Api Pshat and Api Remez, Api Drush, Api Sod. But the Rebbe, in a famous Sikh in Tov Shem Daled, says, but Pshuta Shemikra, how do you explain Pshuta Shel Inyanim? So the Rebbe is Gvaldik Diuk, Shveshachtel Rab Zeir. It doesn't say he killed him. Ein v'shachat elo moshach. The main thing of Shchita is drawing it upward, moshach. It's actually ha'ara from the Rebbe in Tov Shem Ches, and I put in Maimer, he already writes it, B'kitzur. Kom le Rabbe means great. Rab Zeira is small, Zeira Zeira. He came and taught him Primis HaTeir. That's the Psuma. Why? Primis HaTeir is Yayin. Nichnis Yayin Yotze Seid. It's connected to Primis HaTeir. But he was Megalit in Primis HaTeir higher than his Kalim because he was Rab Zeira and he was Rabbe. Kom le Rabbe. He elevated him. But he caused Kleis HaNefesh. And the Rebbe gave examples for the Kleis HaNefesh. Story with the Modrish Rebbe when he sang a song that allowed him not to feel the pain of surgery. A story of the Rebbe Rashab who was concentrating for hours, not knowing what time and space he was in. A form of Kleis HaNefesh. He did cause Kleis HaNefesh, but not with a knife, God forbid. It was through Primis HaTeirah. And then he brought him back. The next year, Rabbi Zayda said he's not ready for such a Grace Gilui. So you see from here an unbelievable understanding of Purim. That's why Taki Yayin, Nichnis Yayin, Yotze Seid. Seid is Gematria Yayin. 70. The same Gematria. Okay, so what's the lesson we learn from this? The lesson we learn from this is that Purim is Adala Yoda, Take, higher than Das, but it has to be in a way that ultimately comes into Kalim as well. It's not just complete. Take Adala Yoda ben Horer Haman Baruch Mordechai, but to a place where you're able to contain it. So someone asked the question, if Rabbi killed Rab Zayda teaching him too much Chassidus, do we need to be careful not to learn too much Chassidus? Is that the lesson? Should we derive from the story that one ought to be careful how much Chassidus says they learn? Or should we weaponize Chassidus and teach too much of it to our enemies and Hamas, but then refuse to revive them the next day until they return the Hashdas safely? Okay, back to tongue-in-cheek. Fine, a nice Purim Teirele. No, that's not the answer. The answer is learn tremendous amount of Chassidus. But make sure the Chassidus isn't Kalim, like the Rebbe brings, the Alter Rebbe would learn Primis HaTeirah with Rabbi Avram HaMalach. And once he sensed that Rabbi Avram HaMalach was going up, Rotzei, without the shuv. So he gave him a bagel, or sometimes it says a bagel and butter to ground him. So to learn Chassidus, but in a way that's manifests inside the Kalim. So Purim takes us to a higher level, but it has to be done in a responsible fashion. I'm going to cover a few more questions, simply because of limited time. And I have to apologize, some questions I wanted to address, to be honest, but let's go back to the question about Esther. How she was allowed to do what she did. So the question, the obvious question, the famous question, how could Esther have relations? How could she have relations with Achashverosh, especially according to the opinion that she was married? Like the Gemara says in Megillah, it says bite. You shouldn't read bite, beise. So there's opinion that she's like a stepdaughter or a niece, but then it says beise, like a wife of Mordechai, which just makes her Eshes Ish. So how could she have had relations with Achashverosh? It's from the Gimel Averis, Yarig Val Yavi. You're supposed to die before you do that. So the general answer to this question, I'll take it further. Someone writes, my question is a general one, specifically about Megillah Esther. Sometimes the Gemara changes the spelling or pronunciation of a word in a pasuk in Tanakh in order to teach us a lesson or a drash. We say every day, don't read Banayach, but Benoyach. Okay. Generally, these don't have halachic ramifications. However, in Megillah 13a, Rav Meir changes the last word in Esther, Bei Zayin, from Lebas to Lebayis, meaning that Mordechai didn't take Esther as a daughter, but as a house, meaning as a wife. And he compares it to what it says in Shmuel Beis, Yud Beis Gimel. This causes obvious serious problems for Esther as how she was allowed to marry Achashverosh. Why not just leave the pasuk alone? Especially since verses 3, 8, and 19 state clearly that only psulas were taken by the king. As to verse 17, which implies also married women, see Malbim explanation. Why make things more difficult than they are? So there's a lot of explanations on this big question. Someone says that maybe she sent a shed in her place. So briefly, the general answer is given that she was forced. It was not up to her. So if she went and did an act, that would be the violation. She hid from them. She didn't want to be taken by Achashverosh's people. And finally she was forced. But that still doesn't answer the question, because later she comes to Achashverosh because she wants something from him. And that's already at her own volition. So that goes back to the Nedi B'Yehuda I mentioned, where he says there can be an exception when it comes to saving the Jewish people. You're not just talking about a yochid. So just to have relations, that is absolutely, you have to die before that happens. And there's still discussion around that as well. I'm just being brief about it. As far as Mordechai goes, we already discussed earlier why they can't compare the two. It's a whole different story. Let's see here. So we'll go, what other questions can we address? I'm just looking for something to end on a high note. Okay. So the question is asked, why do we wear Purim costumes? And essentially, also in general, different things on Purim. Someone asked, what's the origin of the Purim Teda? Do we wear costumes on Purim to symbolize hiding our true identity, to commemorate that Hashem hid himself during the Purim story and his name is not even mentioned in the Megillah? But why do we need costumes to hide ourselves? Because our physical bodies already hide our true identity, which is our neshama. Okay, good question. So that is correct. It's one of the reasons masks, costumes. And in a sense, the same thing with Purim Teda. We're not talking about frivolous and the superficial joy. We're talking about v'napachu, a transformation. So it's one thing to say, okay, we almost were, it could have been a terrible genocide, and we were saved, and we're besimcha. But it's v'napachu simcha. It comes to teach us that what you see is not what you get. Firstly, Hashem's miracles are hidden. That's why his name is hidden. So we wear a costume, we're demonstrating that type of an apachu. What you see is not what you get. It's a whole different reality. And it's a reality that can be exact opposite of what you think is the worst, and it became the best. Like unfortunately, for some, it's become somewhat frivolous. People do things that are nonsense. But when you see a Purim, you saw a Purim by the Rebbe, and the Simcha, it was a whole higher level. Ad Yoda was not, God forbid, Shtuz de Lumazech. It was Shtuz de Gedusha, going beyond. And beyond, there's a place where, yes, darkness is transformed to light. So there's a place where darkness and light become like one, but in the negative way. Light becomes like darkness, I wod say. But then there's the ishapche, the napechu. And that's really the big part of Purim. That's why Purhu a what's a Geidel? Geidel is not logical. You're relying on Hashem. A lottery. And who threw the lottery? Haman of all people. So there's that attitude of not just celebrating our victory, but celebrating it like topsy-turvy, so to speak. Everything's turned inside out. The language of Chassidus, we think Elam is b'pshitas, the world is a given. And Elikus b'ishchachas, and Elikus is a novelty, is an innovation. The exact opposite. The world is the glove. We see the glove all the time. We turn the glove inside out. There's a hand inside there. The Elikus is b'pshitas. Elikus is the reality. Ad layada. higher than das, higher than structure, higher than definitions, higher than names. And Elamus is bischatches. The world is a novelty. And suddenly you look around. What is this world? That's the Chiddush. That's what Purim signifies, and that's his power. So I think this is a good place to conclude, as much as one can conclude. Many more questions came in, but I'll stop here. May we all have a Freilich and Purim, a real, truly Freilich Purim, a true Nepachu. Chedesh Hashem Nepach Lemen Nepachu, especially what's going on at Yisrael, that there should be the miracle even before Purim. All the hostages should be released. Elimination of the enemies. Like the decree that was passed, all the enemies should only be La Yehudim, Esa, Erev, Simcha, V'sasin, V'yikar. And we should march right into the Gula Amitis Vashlema, Mismach Gula Gula, from Purim into the Gula Amitis Vashlema. So when it comes Pesach already, L'Shana Abba Yerushalayim, we're ready in Yerushalayim, we could then say, obviously next year for sure we'll be there. Everyone have a Freilich and Purim, a Freilich and Tomid. This has been MyLife Chassidus Applied, Purim edition. We're here every Sunday, 8 to 9 p.m. Be well and be blessed. A Freilich and Purim.